Good afternoon and welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists December webinar. My name is Kim Ponzio and I am a past president of SWS and the current chair of the SWS webinar committee. And I'm going to be your moderator today. The general format for today's webinar will be a 45-minute presentation by our speaker, which will be followed by approximately 15 minutes for questions and announcements. I want to offer a special welcome to any non-member guests that we have joining us today for our quarterly free webinar. All of our webinars are complimentary to SWS members, but once a quarter we open it up to the public. And our next free webinar will be held in March. So before we get started with the presentation today, I'd like to give our guests a quick overview of what SWS is all about. Since its founding in 1980, the Society of Wetland Scientists has continued to grow. We now have over 3,000 members worldwide. We're committed to providing our members with meaningful resources that promote wetland education, conservation, and restoration globally. In addition to these complimentary monthly webinars, SWS membership includes full access to the Wetlands Journal, the Wetland Science and Practice Journal, and other professional journals. You have discounted rates for the professional certification program and access to regional chapter and section activities and discounted registration at the SWS annual meeting, which next year will be held in Denver, Colorado. And also the opportunity to network with wetland professionals from around the world. So please visit our website at www.sws.org and learn more about the membership benefits. So before we get started with the webinar, I just want to take a moment to familiarize you with the GoToWebinar system. On the right hand of your screen, there's a control panel that looks like this example on the slide. And at the top, you'll see the audio pane where you can adjust the webinar audio either using your telephone or computer speakers. And at any time during the presentation, you can type your questions in the questions pane just below that. And our presenter will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. And if you'd like a copy of today's slides, underneath of that, you'll see the handouts pane on the control panel, and you just click on that PDF and you can download that. As a reminder, webinar certificates worth 1 hour participation are available upon request and can be used to apply or renew your professional wetland scientist or your WIPIT, your wetland professional and training certification. So please contact SWS staff if you're interested in getting a certificate. You can also get a certificate if you view the webinar recordings. And all of our webinars are recorded and archived, so you can, as a member, you can have complimentary viewing of those on our past webinars page. In fact, this presentation today will be recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording following the webinar. As a matter of fact, we have a new YouTube channel that has some of our past free webinars and a webinar from Colombia. So if you want to go ahead and look at our YouTube channel, you'll see some free webinars there. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that's going to pop up at the end of the webinar. So we ask you also, if you use Twitter, to use hashtag SWS webinar to tweet about today's webinar. So let's test the questions pane, and at the same time I'll get some demographics about where everybody is participating from. So if you could just put the state or the country that you're participating from and the number of participants that you have with you, I appreciate that. We'll see what we can see today. I see Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Colorado, Washington State, California, Washington, British Columbia. Oh my gosh, they're just going down the list. Florida, Canada, we've got quite a few from Canada, Minnesota, South Africa. Wyoming and New York. So we have quite a few people online today. I think the registration is very high registration for people watching the webinar today. So thank you for doing that. So with the logistics out of the way, let's get started with our webinar. So it's my pleasure today to welcome the presenter, Dr. Paul Keddy. Dr. Keddy has been a biologist, a writer, and scholar for more than 40 years. He was a professor of ecology at 3 different universities and now is an independent scholar living on the edge of a large wetland deep within the deciduous forest of Lanark County in southern Canada. He has written over 100 scholarly papers and even more essays, most of which can be found on his website listed as www.drpaulkeddy.com. He achieved international designation as a highly cited researcher, has awards from the Society of Wetland Scientists and the Environmental Law Institute, and locally is designated as a champion for nature. His best-known books include Wetland Ecology and Plant Ecology, both of which offer a global perspective on general principles in ecology and their applications to conservation. He also co-edited the book, The World's Largest Wetlands, and in his spare time, he has written 2 self-published natural history guides, one for Lanark County, which won the W.E. Saunders Award from Ontario, and Ontario Nature, and one from Louisiana. So the focus of his career has been upon general principles that organize ecological communities, with emphasis on plants and wetlands. His focus on plants was, in his opinion, a rational decision, because the inescapable fact that more than 90% of the biomass on Earth is comprised of plants. He has a particular soft spot for turtles, frogs, and alligators, but says that getting the vegetation right is essential to provide habitat for such species. He thinks that science should be used to solve problems in the real world, and hence has spent many hours advising on wetland conservation in areas including Nova Scotia, the Great Lakes watershed, and coastal Louisiana, with lesser forays including San Francisco Bay and the Florida Everglades. He has served organizations including the National Science Foundation, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, World Wildlife Fund, and the Nature Conservancy. He also puts his money where his mouth is. Over 40 years, he has slowly bought nearly a square mile of forest and wetland in Lanark County, habitat which has now been donated to the local land trust as a nature sanctuary. He continues to write and lecture, and thankfully he is doing a webinar for us today. And his latest book is the new edition of Plant Ecology. He has given lectures in Washington, Toronto, Madrid, Granada, and Lyon, as well as Perth, Altamont, and Lanark Village. So welcome, Dr. Keddy. Welcome, Paul. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Welcome, everyone. I'm looking forward to talking with you this afternoon. I have to also thank Kara, who's working in the background, making sure that the system works. And also, I have to thank the Society for Wetland Scientists for giving me this opportunity. I understand we have some first-time visitors with us who may be attending their first webinar. If that makes you feel any better, this is also my first webinar, so we can learn the process together. In preparation, I unplugged my phone and I've locked the house cats out of my office. So if you hear any meowing in the background, don't let it worry you. They're fine, but I don't want them sitting on my desk when I'm talking to you. Oh, special welcome to people who are coming from other continents. I believe we have possibly some participants from Europe, and I heard someone from South Africa. We may even have some people joining us from China, although if they are, they unfortunately are in about the middle of the night. So to start off, yes, I'm not institutionalized. Most of the scientists that you will have met are at research institutions or universities, and I am now living in the forest. We apparently have lost keyboard control for me. It was working till the last minute, folks. We had it all up and working, but you know how life is. So I'm going to be asking Kara to change the slides for me. Next, please, Kara. The yellow dot shows you where I am, north of Lake Ontario. And you can imagine that you've come out to visit me. The road on the upper right goes into my house. And usual comment from visitors is, how can anyone live out so far in the forest? I didn't think I'd ever reach the house. And that always makes me feel good I like being surrounded by trees. The lower slide shows the scene from my office window, and that wetland has been hovering with just about a layer of ice, but not quite. Until 2 days ago, the temperature plunged and it's now solid ice with a layer of snow. Next slide. So I ask you to imagine yourself coming up my front walkway. I have a pair of chairs out, and we're going to sit down together and talk about wetlands. And since this is a webinar, there's nobody sitting at the back of the auditorium. You each have a front row seat, or even better still, you can imagine you're sitting in a chair at my house while we talk about wetlands. Next. So the talk is about 5 causal factors, and it's the first time I have broached this topic, although it's buried in my books and papers in various places, but I want to bring it right out to the forefront for today's presentation. The suggestion is going to be that if we know just 5 forces that act on wetlands, we'll be quite knowledgeable about them indeed. I should explain that I'm using the word causal factor as the most general term I can think of. You may find that there's a lot of duplication in language in ecology because it's still quite a young science. So sometimes causal factors are called key factors or environmental factors, drivers, filters, or by analogy with physics, even forces. So I'm going to try to stick with the term causal factors today, but you will likely hear me slip back into talking about environmental factors as well. Next. One slide to remind us why we're all here today. Whether we're in South Africa or California or some of my own neighbors here in Lanark County. We're here because we share an interest in wetlands. And it's become very clear that wetlands are an absolutely vital component of the life support system for this planet. At the lower left, I have a list of just some of the services that wetlands provide. They provide flood control, water purification. They are the most productive habitat for wildlife on the planet. They're cranking out fish and birds and mammals at an astonishing rate. And in some parts of the world, these wetlands are the key protein source for communities along the rivers. They also provide oxygen and store carbon. So where we are right now in history is we're trying to understand how these work so we can ensure that they continue to perform these vital services for our planet. And on the far right, we have journals, scientific journals like Wetlands, that are devoted to the study of wetlands. So this is where you go for the latest information from experts. And of course, we have our expert society, the Society for Wetland Scientists. So these organizations are very important because they allow us to communicate with one another. And so today we probably have a mixture of people. We have practicing scientists. We have younger scientists who are trying to get up to speed. We have students. We have managers who are trying to apply the scientific principles. And we may even have some decision makers. So welcome all of you. Of course, we're facing one problem, and that is that our knowledge about wetlands is growing rapidly. And it may be odd that I call that a problem. You see, 50 years ago, I'd say our problem with wetland conservation and wetland ecology altogether was we didn't have enough information. But now we're in an era where lots of new information is coming out. So every few months, there's a new copy of Wetlands on my desk or on my hard drive. And next. Oh, I may have control back. I have control back, I think, Kara. So let me try. The point is, of course, that there's not just that one journal, Wetlands, coming out. There are many other scientific journals you also have to keep up on. So, for example, Ecology comes out with astonishing regularity. And then, for those of us interested in applications, there's journals like Restoration Ecology. Scientists everywhere are very busy producing new work, and sometimes I actually worry that we're now so busy writing new work that no one is taking the time to read it and synthesize it. So that at least is a task I've taken on at this phase in my career, and partly explains my emphasis on books. But with so much information flowing in, it's a real challenge to keep up with it. So what are our solutions for dealing with this information overload? I have some on this slide, and I want to tell you none of them really work, but we're going to go through them anyway. One way to deal with it is to specialize on one type of wetland. To say, I'm only going to read about mangroves, or I'm only going to read about peatlands. And then when you have an international scientific conference, there'll be one room for the people studying mangroves and one room for the people studying peatlands. And often similar ideas are being developed, and these groups barely talk to one another. Another way to get around information overload is to specialize on one organism. So we have biologists who just focus on ducks or fish or egrets or a single species of plant like Phragmites. And of course, again, the information then gets broken down very narrowly, and it's very easy to start looking at a wetland as a duck farm or a fish farm, rather than looking at it as a whole unit. The other solution is to specialize by region. So there's a huge number of people studying the Everglades, a lot of people working on coastal restoration in Louisiana. And then, of course, the Amazon has more species of fish than any other river in the world. But if you focus by region, you also get trapped. I was surprised when working in Louisiana at the number of people who openly admitted they didn't read scientific papers of work that wasn't done in Louisiana, which meant really that we were trapped reinventing the wheel, not using good work that had already been done elsewhere and could simply be moved. So all of these solutions should have a quotation mark around them, because they lead to poor communication among scientists. They lead to poor communication among managers. The peatland people can't talk to the mangrove people. It ends up with money being wasted as we repeat work that's already been done well elsewhere. And so overall, it produces a significant inefficiency. And with so many wetlands at risk, and so many different scientists and managers involved, we can't afford this inefficiency. So hence today, I'm going to say, let's try simplifying by focusing on key causal factors. I have 5: hydrology, fertility, natural disturbance, competition, and other factors. And I'm going to walk you through those 5 in the next half hour. There's going to be quite a few examples, and they will be superficial because I'm putting them in to illustrate a point. And you will have to go back if you want to know more details about them. Some people may think, wait, how can we possibly simplify such a complicated system with just a few forces? So I want to remind you that physicists can explain the universe with only 4 forces: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong force, and the weak force. So if 4 forces will explain galaxies, possibly 4 will also work for wetlands. Although there is an argument that biological systems are indeed far more complicated than physical systems. So I'm going to say all the same, we don't want to succumb to physics envy. I mean, the world is full of physicists, and I all think they're wonderful people, and they're very proud of their discoveries. And we don't want to fall into envying them, but maybe we can learn from them. So let's try looking at a few forces. I want to briefly say something about each before I launch in. So first of all, when we're talking about hydrology, we're talking about flooding. But there's an important distinction here between two categories of work. In one case, we're just generally interested in the amount of flooding it takes to produce a wetland. But we've increasingly learned that most wetlands actually have flooding occurring in pulses, a pulse of flooding followed by a dry period. And so we also have to consider the variance in the flooding. When we talk about fertility, we're talking mostly about the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the two most important mineral elements for the growth of plants and for the production of human bodies and animal bodies. The term natural disturbance, the word disturbance is carelessly used in a lot of writing. I want to emphasize that word natural, and it refers to something that occurs as a short-lived event and removes biomass from a wetland. Competition. We know that in upland and wetland situations, there's a process ongoing where plants are struggling to acquire nutrients and light, and eventually just a few species that are most shade tolerant seize most of the space. Some of you may also know this under succession, the term succession. So even if you're interested in frogs or ducks or turtles primarily, the structure of the habitat in which these species are living is being driven in one direction by this process of competition. Finally, we have other factors, and there's quite a long list of them. The point is that often you just need to pick one or more of these and you have your full list to work with. All right, so let's start with the first one, hydrology. The main point is wetlands are a result of flooding. Flooding acts as a stress on plants because when the ground is flooded, the soil rapidly becomes hypoxic or anoxic. That is, the microorganisms quickly use up the oxygen in the soil, and the plants have no oxygen in order to keep their roots alive. So wetland plants are stressed by being flooded, and plants in wetlands have various mechanisms for dealing with this lack of oxygen. The water lily shown here, for example, takes oxygen in the younger leaves. It's moved down into the rhizome and where the roots are given oxygen, and then the waste products go out through the older leaves. So looking on the right then, there's the cover from Wetland Ecology, and the artist, Howard Conybeare, who did this original cover painting for me, has very carefully shown how the animals in the wetland, and we have birds, fish, and turtles shown by the 3 arrows. There's other animals buried in there if you look carefully. These may be obvious, as in the case of the egret. They may be hard to see, as in the case of the turtle, but the point is they're all still dependent on plants. And so this process of hypoxia and anoxia in the soil is indirectly affecting them as well. As a consequence, it doesn't matter where you go in the world, you see different vegetation types and therefore different ecological communities being the result of different amounts of flooding. So here's a cross-section across the Amazon River. You can see many different names for the different vegetation types. And these are each produced by different duration of flooding. In fact, people have spent a lot of time describing how wetlands change with water depth. Here's just 6-line drawings that summarize different examples from around the world. At the upper left, we have a mangrove swamp. At the lower right, we have a pool in a peatland. The point is that everywhere you go, the wetland is being sorted into different communities by their amount of tolerance to flooding. Now, it's one thing to make a general statement like that. It's quite another to actually find real numbers. I've been working for the last year with Dan Campbell, and he and I have been going through the literature, the scientific papers, trying to find studies that have put real numbers on how much flooding produces different vegetation types. You'd be surprised how rare that data is. So we know in a general way that flooding is important, but no one yet has a guidebook where you can look up how much flooding produces which kinds of wetlands. Here's an example, a positive example. It actually goes back to the Agassiz National Refuge in Minnesota, where a series of studies were done in the early 1950s, looking for what sort of water levels would maintain marshes for migrating waterfowl. They had some very good experimental work and basically found that if you take a marsh and you flood it for 5 years, the plants drown and it becomes open water. If, on the other hand, you draw the water down and keep it dry for 5 years, you dewater it for 5 years, the marshes turn into willow thickets. So there's a window in between too much and too little flooding that maintains marshes. And on the right here, I have a graph showing 2 common species of marsh plants and how they performed after they were flooded. And you can see in both of these common marsh species, after 5 years of continuous flooding, they had drowned. And when the water was deeper, it only took 3 years. This is a really nice study. And even though it's a relatively old study, published in 1963, it still has this sort of vital information in it. Now, to talk more about this alternate wetting and drying, this is an absolute fundamental characteristic, particularly of wetlands along rivers, but also many other wetlands as well. So here's data from 6 different rivers around the world with the discharge from 1930 to about 1990. Look at how the water goes up and down every year. This is why there are huge wetlands along these rivers. The high water period creates the wetland, and then the low water period is a short-lived state, and then high water comes up again next year. I also want you to look at the second slide down, which is the Nile. Something horrible happened there. Look, the flood pulses disappeared sometime in the late 1960s. That was when the High Aswan Dam was built. And since then, wetlands have begun to degrade along the lower Nile, and even the sardine fishery offshore that was dependent upon sediment and the wetlands, that sardine fishery collapsed. So this is a natural system, and the wetlands along rivers absolutely require this pulse system. Of course, what we would like to know as scientists is, all right, well, if we look at a cross-section of a riverbank, how much flooding does it take to produce the different community types we see? Here's a very general sketch of a typical wetland that would occur on almost any river around the world. Could be the Rhine, it could be the Mississippi. There's basically 4 zones. At the lowest zone is the aquatic zone, which is continually flooded. At the upper edge of the marsh, at the upper edge of the wetland, you have woody plants like willows and various flood-tolerant trees. In between, we have 2 other types of vegetation, a marsh and a wet meadow. Those 3 red dots then mark a critical point where the environment changes just enough that we flip from one vegetation type to another, from one ecological state to another. Ideally, as scientists, we would be able to know what those exact points are so we can predict how different vegetation types will arise out of different flood durations. I've done a little bit of work on this myself. I'm going to share two quick examples with you. Let's go to the Ottawa River, which is north of me and flows through our capital city. If you look along the Ottawa River, you can see there's two significantly different wetland types. There's silver maple swamp at the higher elevations, which is dominated by trees. There's a sharp demarcation, and then below that, at a lower elevation, is marsh. Well, what is the critical flooding regime that flips you from marsh to swamp or back? This is important because we're building dams upstream and we're changing the flood regime along the river. Here we actually have a model that we created by studying the transition point at a large number of different studies, and we were able to show that you can predict whether you're going to have silver maple swamp or marsh, and it's tied into actually the timing of two flood pulses each spring. There are often several pulses in the spring depending upon which part of the watershed is melting or is experiencing heavy rain. So the earlier the first flood ends, the more likely you are to have silver maple swamp. The later the second flood starts, the more likely you are again to have silver maple swamp. So there's an interplay between the two of these, and they are controlling whether you have silver maple or marsh. A practical example from my hometown. This is the Appleton silver maple swamp. It's one of the three largest silver maple swamps in this county. It's likely far older than the pyramids in Egypt. It goes back millennia. It's designated a provincially significant wetland, and it is the product of flood pulses. Every year, high water sweeps down that river, flows through the swamp, carries in nutrients, and then following that, there's a low water period, and the soil dries out enough that the trees can breathe. Now, this has been going on for thousands of years, but we now have a problem. The trees in the swamp, according to local visitors, are drowning. Apparently, the tree canopies are dying. And at the upper right, I have a link to a study done by a local natural history society showing, I say quite convincingly, that the trees are drowning because a hydroelectric dam constructed downstream in Elmont is raising water levels by only about 25 centimeters. But it's doing it at the wrong time of year, in August, when those trees are dependent upon oxygen getting into the soil. So this example illustrates the importance of flood pulses, that high water periods are indeed followed by low water periods, which allow wetland plants to put oxygen down into their roots. Raising the water level by a relatively small amount at the wrong time of the year can have disastrous effects upon the trees. I mean, if you raise the water level 20 centimeters in the spring, it wouldn't probably matter because the trees are dormant and they tolerate immense amounts of flooding in the spring. And here also is just one of many examples from wetland science, which show even when you get the science right, sometimes there's a problem with communication. So the government agencies responsible for the silver maple swamp have not yet required that the water levels be managed in an appropriate way for the survival of the Appleton silver maple swamp. And I'm sure many of you listening have your own example from different locations around the world where even when the science is done, it isn't always listened to. And I guess that's a reminder to us to keep pushing with communication. This got me interested, this whole issue of how much flooding is too much, got me interested because along many rivers you also see an abrupt end to wetlands. At a certain point, the flooding is just too much. So we set up this artificial pond on campus with a bulldozer in Louisiana, carefully graded it, and planted 10 different wetland plants in lanes that were narrowly cut into the shoreline, and grew them for 4 years, and measured the flood tolerance of each of these 10 common wetland species. I can't walk you through the 10 different species, which are shown on the right, but I want you to note that the horizontal axis is the percent of the growing season flooded. Half of the wetland plants that we used could only tolerate flooding for 50% of the growing season. More flooding than that, and they died. The other wetland plants were more tolerant of flooding, but you'll notice again, as you creep up towards 80% of the growing season, many of them are showing significantly reduced growth. So these kinds of experiments show how we could actually go about quantifying what these key transition points are. Well, that's enough for flooding. Let's move on to fertility, which is, in my view, the second most important factor after flooding. Flooding followed by fertility. Fertility, we're talking about the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus. Here we have 4 different types of wetlands. Northern peat bogs at the upper left, the Everglades at the upper right, pine savannas along the Gulf Coast at the lower left, and typical lake shore from the Canadian Shield country. All of these are examples of systems where nitrogen and phosphorus are extremely low. And as a consequence, for example, if you could identify the plants in the lower left slide, there are large numbers of carnivorous plants growing in that savanna. They're so desperate for nitrogen and phosphorus that they're actually capturing insects. Now we're going to borrow from terrestrial ecology. There's some very interesting work coming out suggesting that nutrients actually have the capacity to shift an ecological community between 2 main states. So these boxes are ecological community. We have herbivores at the top, plants. In the green box, plants produce litter. The litter falls down and supports a soil food web, and then that in turn percolates into soil chemistry. Well, David Wardle has published a good amount of work now suggesting that there are basically 2 fundamentally different types of communities. There are those with low nutrients that have slow growth, low rates of grazing, and fungi are the primary decomposers. There's another fundamentally different type of system where there's fast growth by plants, high amounts of grazing, and bacterial food webs dominate. Which means that when you fertilize a site, you're actually doing something quite fundamental to it. You're flipping it from one state to another. And so when we talk about using wetlands to treat sewage, we have to be very careful here, because what we're doing is moving the system from one state to another state. I'm going to give you another quick experiment that shows just how profound the effects of fertilization can be over even a very short period of time. So when I was at the University of Ottawa, we had an experiment with 120 mini wetlands, each in its own tub. Each was sown with 20 species of wetland plants. They all got the same species. We created 12 environments that we thought were typical of different conditions you might find along river courses. And we produced each one at a high and low fertility level. Ran the experiment for 4 years. I'm just going to show you 2 sets of results. If you look at the left-hand set of histograms, don't worry about the different environments. Just look at the bars. The green bars are the fertilized sites, the fertilized treatments. If you fertilize, you increase the amount of biomass. In this case, about 5 times as much biomass in the fertilized wetlands as in the unfertilized wetlands, which means you have a very different looking community. And as an example of other changes that are occurring, look on the right. Here we have data on the number of plant species alive at the end of the experiment. Fertilizing cut the number of species about in half. The mechanism there is, you might think fertilizing is good for all plants, but it's not. It preferentially stimulates the plants with the fastest growth rates that are best able to take up the nitrogen and phosphorus, and they crowd out and kill the weaker competitors. So fertilizing will also reduce plant diversity. If you want to do more reading on this, on the topic of nitrogen, there's a lovely book called The Inadequate Environment, which is a review of cases, many cases, where nitrogen actually controls the abundance of animals in a landscape. I think you'd enjoy reading that. On the right-hand side, phosphorus. Well, one of the absolute characteristics of the Everglades is its extremely low levels of phosphorus. And if you allow phosphorus to enter the system, which is now happening with runoff from sugarcane fields, the Everglades begin to change. And it's not only the plants that change, but the animals change as well. So nitrogen and phosphorus are very important in controlling the type of wetlands you have. Third causal factor, natural disturbance. I said to you that we're using natural disturbance in a very specific way. It refers to removal of biomass. There's 2 kinds of natural disturbance operating out there. The first is abiotic disturbances, fire being an obvious one. The second is grazing, in which animals are removing the biomass. Here we have an experiment from a marsh in Louisiana showing that it is conceivable that muskrats and nutria can completely strip the vegetation from a marsh, and the only way you can measure this is by putting in fenced-in plots that the herbivores can't get into. So grazing can also have a huge cause huge changes in wetlands. So I want to emphasize that biomass removal is the key feature going on here. We're going to use this word quite precisely, and that we can measure different components of disturbance, like duration of the disturbance, intensity, frequency, and area. Those of us in the north, yes, first the Everglades, my friends, then the north. So the Everglades are a really nice example of how natural disturbance produces the different types of vegetation you see. Here is a classic diagram showing the vegetation of the Everglades from a paper by Peter White. And if you just look at the lower part, Peter White has a series of arrows showing how the vegetation changes from left to right, from shallow water sloughs to eventually sawgrass and finally tree islands. So the vegetation naturally tends to move to the right, and fire reverses that process. It removes living biomass and sometimes even burns the peat. So the actual array of vegetation types you have in the Everglades is a result of a balance between the rate at which the vegetation is slowly changing through time and the rate at which fires reverse that process and therefore keep a natural array of plant communities. So in this case, even birds and mammals are very dependent on fire for maintaining the sloughs in which they need to feed. I need to mention quickly for those who live further north that ice is also an important source of natural disturbance. And during the spring, ice freezes onto the shoreline and it gets moved around by the water. It tears trees out, tears out chunks of sod, and the resulting debris is transported downstream. So some of the, on the far left here, some of the absolutely classic features of wetlands in deltas, way downstream, these features come from sediment and debris that's been cut out by water and ice upstream and transported down the delta. And if you look at rivers where there aren't any hydroelectric dams, such as this one on the right, you can see how during the low water time of the year, how in the spring, the water flowing along with the ice has completely stripped the forest from the riverbank, creating a quite distinctive array of meadow communities. We see fewer and fewer of these as time goes on. So overall then, we've got just 3 causal factors so far, and I'm going to suggest to you we're already well on our way to a general model. And in this model, we have 6 arrows because you can take each of those 3 factors and either increase it or decrease it. So you start off with a natural wetland, which I've got in the center there, circled in green. And if you increase or decrease the flooding, the natural disturbance, or the fertility, you start changing the wetland, often in quite predictable ways. So it's quite possible now that these forces have been going on for long enough that many of the wetlands we're looking at in our landscape today have been significantly changed by these causal factors. And if you make a list of different issues you can read about, whether it's the decline of coastal wetlands in Louisiana, the shrub invasion of floodplains in the Rocky Mountains, or disappearing birds like the Basra warbler, or in Iraq, or the wood storks in Florida, they are all tied in to these few causal factors that are changing the landscape in certain ways. Those 3 factors might be enough, but in the last few minutes of the talk, I just want to point out there are true other factors we may want to build into our thinking. The first is competition among plants. Or, as some of you know, a more general word for this could be succession. How plant communities change predictably through time, owing primarily to competition for light. So if we go back to this familiar diagram from the Everglades, the green arrow shows succession. This is the natural tendency of competition in plant communities, and the red arrow then shows disturbance, which is reversing competition. Another example, highly relevant today, comes from the Peace River in Alberta. This is an old study from the 1970s. On the upper right, we have 2 common wetland types that existed in the Lake Athabasca Delta and Wood Buffalo National Park. They built a hydroelectric dam in 1968 on the Peace River, and the vegetation went through a series of dramatic changes, leading eventually to shrubs and to forests, with catastrophic consequences for the fish, the mammals, and even the wood buffalo. So the tendency for plants communities to push towards the forested state is widespread. Interestingly enough, we now have data from watercourses around the world, and these data show that the construction of dams is now so widespread that very few rivers have the natural hydrology left. This work by Christer Nilsson shows green watersheds as still having relatively natural pulse ecology, and the red watersheds are heavily modified, which means that succession is now changing the floodplain vegetation dramatically in those red water basins. We're wrapping up here. Oh, hang on, folks. So we have a final category, other factors. And depending upon where you are in the world, you probably are going to need to know about at least one other causal factor. If you're working near the coast, it's probably going to be salinity. And salinity has a huge effect on wetlands, but it's superimposed upon these processes we've already described. If, on the other hand, you're working on wetlands near New York or Beijing, or in much of Europe, the road network is probably going to be an important factor that's affecting the wetlands. And then we have a variety of other ones that you could consider. I have a list of these other factors in Wetland Ecology if you wish to read it. So to wrap up, I'm just going to walk you through these 5 factors again, and then we can take some questions. So when we're talking about flooding, I want you to remember that the primary effect of flooding is by producing anoxic conditions in the soil, and that these different durations of flooding produce different kinds of wetland communities. And that often it's complicated to measure this because the flooding arrives in a pulse. Second issue, fertility and nutrients, usually nitrogen and phosphorus. Rainwater is almost distilled water. So rivers start with very low nutrient levels, and the nutrients get added in on the way downstream, particularly from farmland and sewage outflow from cities. Then we have natural disturbance, which, as I suggested, has biotic examples like herbivores and abiotic examples like fire or ice. Finally, superimposed on this is succession, which is really controlled by the preceding 3 factors, and then possibly another local factor, which will vary with time and place. So the point is, if we're going out to study wetlands and write articles for journals and try to move our science ahead, I think it's important for us to focus on the most important factors first. And today I've suggested that really there's somewhere between 3 and 5 important factors. And your take-home questions are to think about how this affects your own watershed and what the relative importance of these factors are. Well, thank you for your attention. Even the people in the back of the audience, the very back of the room, I can see you are all very well behaved, and we can now take some questions.
Thank you, Paul. We'll get right to the questions because we just have a little bit of time left. And I will just go ahead and start with those that I have quite a few on the questions from the audience. So the first is, are frequency and variance sufficient to characterize impacts of flood regimes on large-scale spatial patterns of vegetation in wetlands?
Well, the question of whether they're sufficient is an odd choice of words. I think with any scientific process, we have to start with the most important factors first. And so indeed, if we start off with duration and frequency, we have captured a very large proportion of the information. It doesn't mean there aren't other subtle factors, but those will be the 2 important ones.
Well, and I think it's qualified later to talk about maybe some more complicated temporal metrics, considering maybe flood seasonality, which you did address in one of your examples, and maybe offset from the growing season, which you talked about with the silver maple. So I think you did touch on the fact that it isn't just necessarily depth and duration, but also the seasonality. And it could be specific for a specific plant, a specific time of year, or
excuse me, I was just going to add that, of course, superimposed on that is a longer time scale variation. Even in the Everglades, there seems to be a 30-year climate cycle operating. So at larger time scales, we do have wetter periods and drier periods. So this does need to be factored in as well.
Okay, next question is, how do grass or graminoid adaptations to flooding differ from those of trees and other woody species? Because you talked about some flooding on trees.
Oh, all right. Well,
it's the species, obviously, from your Louisiana study were herbaceous species.
Yes, well, the fundamental difference, if we're looking for one, is that herbaceous plants have parenchyma in the stems, which is like a conduit that allows oxygen to be transported down the stems. Trees in general don't have parenchyma. So there's a fundamental difference. And you know from looking at wetland plants, if you've ever been out canoeing, that many of them have quite thick, spongy stems. And this illustrates the amount of parenchyma inside the stem for transporting oxygen. So in general, trees are less flood tolerant than herbaceous plants.
Okay, and so the next one is, so if we're trying to create a wetland with diverse wetland species, what would you suggest how we deal with the fertilization and nutrient issue? Do you have a suggestion about how to balance fertilization and keeping plantings successful? So this is, I assume, a created wetland that's been planted.
I'm going to stick, yes, if you're trying to create artificial wetlands, obviously the first thing is to get the water right. And if also perhaps to contour the site a little so there's some variation in water depth, because different plants do require different water depths, and so do different animals. I would say, and as a general principle, I would keep the fertilization to a minimum, because I can think of many more cases where too much fertilization is actually harmful and will even enhance invasion by invasive species like cattails and Phragmites. So in general, keep it as low as possible.
Okay, I have kind of a different question here instead of the ecology. This is you're from your fans at the Yale School of Forestry. They want to know, as graduate students, professional students, and researchers, what would you focus on studying, or what skills would you build if you were a graduate student today, Paul?
Oh, that's a great question. Hello to the Yale School of Forestry. You know, I think what I would say is to focus on the essentials and the causal factors that all systems have in common. There is a real tendency among ecologists to study things that they like. And I've said this before, that we're putting, forgive me, but we're putting probably too much of our ecological work into birds, which are very attractive creatures. And I enjoy looking at birds as much as anyone else. But if we're trying to understand quickly the fundamental states of the Earth systems, we have to focus on the most common species and the most basic causal factors. Then we can leave the nuance, the nice natural history of turtles or frogs or birds. We can leave that for a generation, but we need to get the essentials, the important key factors done fast now.
Excellent. Okay, and also there's one here about beavers on wetlands. There's a lot of controversy about the impact of beaver on wetlands. Is there a good reference work that you know of that examines this? I suppose that would be your disturbance, your natural disturbance by a biotic factor. Or
well,
not necessarily disturbance, because beavers build a lot of wetlands, right?
You could write a book about beavers, and it's a chance for me to flog my own book. There are beavers in there as a natural source of disturbance and hydrological alteration. I think they're not appreciated fully at the largest scale. They have a huge role to play in maintaining water flow in our rivers. And I once saw a paper somewhere that suggested that some of the severe flooding on the Mississippi could be attributed to the lack of beaver dams way upstream. On the other hand, if you're in a heavily urbanized landscape and you have a few precious little wetlands left, and those wetlands have rare plants like prairie fringed orchids, you probably don't want them flooded by beavers. So it's a matter of context.
Mm-hmm. I do have one more before I have to get to my concluding slide, since it's now 2 o'clock. One of these is, it's kind of a very, I think it's a pretty big incorporative question. So why are wetlands so biologically productive if they are fundamentally stressful environments?
Oh, that's a nice question, because it seems to be a paradox, doesn't it? It does seem to be a paradox. However, I guess what we can say is that compared to, if we look at terrestrial systems, they're also stressed too, and usually it's by absence of rainfall. So the productivity of the Earth's forests overall is largely controlled by rainfall and secondarily by soil fertility. Wetlands have an advantage in that there's always a water supply, first of all, or nearly always. I'm talking in general terms here. Water is rarely limiting. And on top of it, wetlands are receiving nitrogen and phosphorus from the surrounding landscape. So there's a certain amount of natural fertilization going on. And so indeed, if you look at the data, the highest rates of primary production are indeed found in wetlands. So they're like little biological factories scattered over the surface of the earth, producing oxygen and producing wildlife.
Mm-hmm. I do have one more that I want to ask that I didn't want to pass up, and someone noticed that you left out human disturbance in your categories of causal factors, or environmental causal factors. So it's really important factor because we've obviously changed quite a lot of the landscape in the world. So if you include natural disturbance, then why wouldn't we talk about human disturbance?
What I'm asked, I think I was quite clear that humans are having enormous effects on wetlands. What I'm talking about is using our words carefully, so that, for example, fertilizing a wetland or building a dam does not fall within that term disturbance. It's a human perturbation. So it's a matter of choosing our language carefully. Yes, humans are having big effects, but they're having them in many cases by changing one of those other causal factors. And then, of course, when we're talking about other factors, I mentioned road networks, which are, I think, hugely underestimated as a very harmful human-induced change in the environment. But according to the definition I use, we wouldn't call that a disturbance. It's more generally a perturbation or a human-induced effect.
On one of the main causal factors, absolutely. I find that a lot of what we're dealing with in my area is the changes to the hydrology, which is your #1 factor for wetlands, and determining all of the spatial distribution of plant communities, therefore the habitat for animals. So I think that drawing out the differences between a natural disturbance and a human perturbation to those causal factors is really important. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to stop the questions there because we're a few minutes over time. If you did not get your your questions answered, Paul has his email up there, and you can give him send him a little email. And I'm glad that we were able to get through I guess all of the questions in time. for the webinar to end pretty much on time. So please go ahead and contact Paul. Paul, I'm going to do a couple of kind of closer slides. I want folks to know that our next webinar will be on January 18th, so mark your calendars for that. And if you have any ideas for any future webinar presenters or topics, please make sure you do that in the evaluation survey, or you can contact the SWS staff about that. And then make sure you get ready for our annual meeting in Denver, Colorado. Apparently, our registration is already open for that site, so go ahead and do that. And also, I think there's some really good prizes for this SWS photo contest. If you go to our sws.org website, we have a photo contest that you can submit your photos of all of these beautiful wetlands that we're talking about before December 31st. And again, Paul, I want to thank you so much for taking your time out of the wonderful place that you're living up there in Canada at the end of the road where no one believes it'll ever end, and sitting down in a chair and kind of talking with us to the audience today. So I really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone attending today, those that are SWS members and those that are guests that have joined us. So we hope you will join us for our upcoming webinar in January. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and for those of you that are going to Denver, I'll see you in the spring.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone, and happy holidays.